fire crackled softly, its warm glow dancing across the rustic walls of the cabin. Outside, the snow had begun to fall in earnest, blanketing the forest in a silence that felt almost reverent. Inside, laughter filled the air. I sat curled on the worn sofa, nursing a cup of mulled cider, watching my friends with a kind of quiet contentment that I rarely allowed myself to feel. Alex and Emma were arguing over the rules of some card game, their voices raised in mock indignation. Greg stood by the fireplace, stoking the flames, while Sarah leaned against the mantel, recounting some exaggerated tale of her latest hike through the Appalachians. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods, had been Emma's idea. A proper Christmas, she'd said, like something out of a postcard, and for a while it was. The storm had started light, just enough snow to make the world seem magical. We'd brought out blankets, set up a small tree in the corner, and even found a tin of old ornaments to decorate it. By the time the sun set, the snow was falling harder, the wind rattling the windows in earnest. Greg turned on the radio, fiddling with the dial until the static gave way to a local weather report. Severe blizzard warning in effect, the announcer said, his voice devoid of emotion. Residents are advised to stay indoors. Travel is not recommended. Expect power outages and limited visibility. The fire popped loudly, startling Sarah, who laughed and brushed it off. Blizzards are just snow with bad PR, she said, though her usual confidence seemed forced. We tried to make light of it. More cider was poured, and someone, probably Alex, suggested ghost stories. As the wind howled outside, the stories grew darker, the laughter quieter. It wasn't fear exactly, but a shared awareness of the isolation pressing in around us. The power flickered once, then twice. Greg muttered something under his breath and went to check the generator outside. When he returned, his face was flushed, his coat dusted with snow. "Generator's fine," he said, "but it's really coming down out there." I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The radio crackled again, but the voice was gone, replaced by static. Alex turned it off with a shrug. "Looks like we're officially cut off from the world." For a moment, none of us spoke. The wind roared, and somewhere in the distance, a tree groaned under the weight of the snow. Emma clapped her hands, breaking the spell. "All right, who's up for another round of cards?" We played. We laughed. But as the storm grew fiercer, the warmth of the cabin began to feel fragile, like a flame barely holding its own against the dark. When the clock struck midnight, I glanced out the frost-covered window. The snow had buried the world in white, but just for a second, I thought I saw something move between the trees. I told myself it was just the wind. The power went out sometime around 2 in the morning. One moment the cabin was alive with the soft hum of the heater and the flickering light of our Christmas decorations, and the next, it was silent. Not the kind of quiet you welcome, but the heavy, oppressive stillness that seems to swallow even your breath. We huddled near the fireplace as Greg and Alex scrambled to find flashlights and candles. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, its relentless howl almost masking the groaning timbers. The firelight, once cozy, now seemed feeble, casting long, uneasy shadows across the room. "It's fine," Matt said, trying to lighten the mood. "Generators are built for this kind of thing. I'll go check it out." Emma frowned. "You sure? It's pitch black out there. Better than freezing in here." Matt's voice was steady, though he hesitated as he zipped up his coat. He grabbed the flashlight Greg handed him, but when the beam flickered weakly, Matt gave a dry laugh. "Perfect. This thing's as reliable as Alex's poker face. Just hurry back, Emma muttered, her frown deepening. He gave a mock salute and opened the door. The wind burst in like an uninvited guest, carrying with it a spray of snow that hissed against the fire. We watched Matt disappear into the storm, his figure swallowed up almost immediately by the swirling white. We waited. 5 minutes. 10. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the endless wind. "He should be back by now," Sarah whispered, clutching her blanket tightly. "Maybe he got turned around," Greg said, though he didn't sound convinced. "We should check," Emma said, already pulling on her boots. "No," Alex snapped, surprising us all. "We shouldn't all go out there. That's how people get lost. Greg and I will look for him. Stay by the fire." They left with flashlights in hand, their beams barely piercing the storm. The rest of us sat in tense silence, every creak of the cabin magnified in the stillness. When Greg and Alex returned, their faces were pale, their breaths coming in sharp, visible bursts. "We found his flashlight," Greg said, his voice tight, "and tracks in the snow." "But no Matt?" Emma asked, already knowing the answer. Alex shook his head. "The tracks, they just stop. Like he, I don't know, vanished." "And there was something else," Greg added, his eyes flickering toward the door. "A mark in the snow. Red? Like he trailed off, unable to finish." "Like what?" Sarah's voice trembled. "Like something spilled," Alex said flatly. "It's probably nothing, just ice or something. We'll look again when the storm lets up." But we all knew that wasn't true. There was nothing natural about the way the tracks ended, or the way the storm seemed to press closer to the cabin, its howling wind almost purposeful. The fire sputtered as another gust of wind rattled the windows, and in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the dark. By morning, or what we assumed was morning, though the storm had erased any sense of time, the cabin felt smaller, its walls pressing inward as if the weight of the snow outside was slowly crushing it. The fire had burned low, and though Greg and Alex kept feeding it, the warmth didn't seem to reach us anymore. Emma took charge. She always did, her voice steady and practical, even if her hands trembled slightly as she passed out mugs of cold cider. "We need to stay calm," she said, her eyes scanning each of us as though daring us to argue. "Matt wouldn't want us losing our heads." No one answered. The wind had calmed, but only slightly. Beneath its persistent wail, there was something else, an intermittent sound, faint but distinct, a scraping like nails against wood, or branches dragged across the frozen ground. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her face pale. "Just the storm," Greg muttered, though his jaw was tight. "It's not the storm," Alex said. He had been sitting by the window, peering out through a gap in the frost-covered glass. "There's something moving out there." Emma joined him, brushing aside the ice with her sleeve. I followed, reluctant but unable to resist. At first, I saw only the blinding white of the snow and the dark blur of the trees beyond. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw them, tracks. They weren't human. They weren't animal either, at least not any animal I could recognize. The prints were deep and uneven, circling the cabin in wide, deliberate arcs. "Are those Matt's?" Sarah asked from behind us, though her voice lacked conviction. "No," Emma said firmly, stepping back from the window. "No, they're not." Greg stood abruptly. "I'll go look." "No, you won't," Emma snapped. "We stay together, but we can't just—" "We stay together," she repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument. The scraping sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't the trees. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, rhythmic, circling us. Emma grabbed the flashlight, her movements quick and decisive. "We need to see." We opened the door cautiously, the icy air biting at our faces. The world outside was blindingly bright, the snow reflecting what little light the storm allowed. Emma led the way, her footsteps crunching as she followed the tracks. It didn't take long to find them. The same prints we had seen earlier, deep and deliberate, now closer to the cabin. And there, scattered among them, were more of those marks, streaks of red against the pristine white. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Don't touch it," Greg warned, though no one seemed inclined to. The tracks led us in a slow, eerie circle around the cabin, always just out of reach, always disappearing into the trees. Whatever had left them had been watching us, circling us all night. A sharp snap echoed through the woods, like a branch breaking underfoot. We froze. Emma turned off the flashlight, plunging us into the storm's dim, shadowed light. We waited, our breaths shallow and visible in the cold. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by another. A low, guttural noise, almost like a growl but not quite. Back inside, Emma whispered, her voice taut. "Now?" We didn't argue. As we hurried back to the cabin, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees. But there was nothing, just the endless white, the tracks in the snow, and the growing sense that we were not alone. Inside, the door bolted behind us, the silence was worse than the noise. We sat in a tight circle near the fire, no one speaking, each of us listening to the storm and whatever might be hidden within it. For the first time, I wished the power would come back. Not for the heat or the light, but to drown out the terrible stillness pressing against us. The air inside the cabin had grown heavier, pressing down on us as if the storm itself had seeped through the walls. We spoke in low voices, though none of us said aloud what we were all thinking. Matt was gone, and whatever had left those marks outside wasn't far away. Emma broke the silence. "We need more wood, water, anything we can find. This storm isn't letting up. Out there," Sarah's voice was incredulous. "We can't stay locked in here forever," Emma replied, already pulling on her coat. Her determination left no room for argument, though I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes as she glanced toward the door. Reluctantly, we bundled ourselves against the cold. Emma, Greg, Tom, and I were chosen for the task, leaving Sarah and Alex behind to tend the fire and keep the cabin secure. The snow was deeper than before, swallowing our boots and clinging to every surface. The storm seemed quieter, though the stillness felt worse somehow. It was the kind of silence that begged to be broken, though none of us dared to speak. We trudged toward the shed at the edge of the clearing, the place where we had stored extra firewood and supplies when we'd first arrived. The tracks from earlier had been obscured, but faint traces remained, deep impressions, as though whatever had made them was impossibly heavy. Greg reached the shed first, his gloved hands fumbling with the latch. "Hurry up," Emma hissed, her breath visible in the frigid air. The door creaked open, revealing a small stash of wood and a few forgotten cans of food. It was a meager haul, but enough to keep us going for another day. As we loaded up, the noise came again, a low, almost imperceptible rumble, like the growl of a far-off engine. But there were no cars out here, no roads for miles. "Do you hear that?" Tom asked, his voice unsteady. Before anyone could answer, it happened. The snow shifted around us, moving in a way that was unnatural, alive. From the shadows of the trees, something emerged. Not fully visible, its dark form seeming to blend with the storm itself. But its eyes, a piercing, unnatural glow, cut through the white like embers in the darkness. "Run!" Emma shouted, but the command came too late. The creature moved with a speed that defied logic, a blur of shadow and ice. It struck out, and Tom cried out in pain as he fell, clutching his leg. The snow around him turned red, the stark color spreading like ink in water. Greg swung the hatchet he had been carrying, a wild, desperate motion. The creature recoiled, a guttural noise escaping it, a sound that made my stomach turn. Emma grabbed Tom's arm, pulling him upright as Greg, and I formed a haphazard barrier between them and the thing in the snow. It didn't retreat far. Instead, it circled us, its glowing eyes unblinking, its movements deliberate. The snow seemed to shift with it, like a living tide, camouflaging its form. "We have to go," Emma yelled, and we didn't need to be told twice. We half-carried, half-dragged Tom back to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind us. Alex and Sarah stared at us, their faces pale with shock as they took in Tom's injury and the frantic looks on our faces. What happened?" Sarah stammered. "It's real," Greg said, his voice hollow. "It's out there, and it's hunting us." We worked quickly to stop the bleeding, but Tom's leg was a mess, the flesh torn in jagged lines. The creature's attack had been swift but deliberate, as though it knew exactly how to weaken us. As we huddled by the fire, the faint sound of scratching began again, circling the cabin like a predator testing its prey. We were trapped, and the thing outside knew it. The cabin felt smaller now, as if the walls were inching closer, trapping us in a shared dread. None of us could meet each other's eyes, and every sound from outside, the groan of shifting trees, the hiss of the storm, felt deliberate, like the creature was mocking us. It was Emma who broke the silence, her voice firm but low. "We can't stay here. It's only a matter of time before it gets inside." "And go where?" Alex's tone was sharp, edged with panic. "You saw what it did to Tom. We wouldn't make it 5 steps out there." "There's the observation post," Emma said, her gaze steady despite the trembling in her hands. "It's a couple of miles up the ridge. They have a radio there, an emergency line. You want us to climb into the mountains in this?" Greg gestured toward the window, where the snowstorm raged like a living thing. Emma didn't waver. "It's our only chance. We'll freeze or starve if we stay, and that thing out there, it's waiting, watching." The weight of her words settled over us. None of us wanted to admit she was right, but the truth hung in the air like smoke. "We need to be ready," Emma continued. "Weapons, supplies, anything we can carry. We leave at first light." "What about Tom?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. Tom was pale, slumped against the couch with his leg hastily bandaged. He managed a weak smile, though his eyes were glassy. "I'll make it," he said, though none of us believed him. The rest of the night was spent in a frenzy of preparation. Greg sharpened kitchen knives against the stone hearth, the screech of metal grating on our nerves. Emma fashioned torches from torn fabric and lamp oil, while Sarah and I packed what little food and water we had left. Each task felt futile. We weren't soldiers, and this wasn't a battle we could win. But the thought of staying in the cabin, waiting for whatever was out there to break through, was worse. Dawn arrived reluctantly, the storm swallowing most of the light. We dressed in layers, bundling ourselves against the cold, and armed ourselves with our makeshift weapons. Emma led the way, Greg at her side. I stayed close to Tom, helping him limp along while Sarah carried the remaining supplies. Alex brought up the rear, his eyes darting nervously at every shadow. The snow swallowed our footsteps as quickly as we made them, erasing any evidence of our passage. The trees loomed around us, their bare branches clawing at the sky. We hadn't made it far when the sound began. A low, guttural rumble, distinct from the wind. "It's following us," Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Keep moving," Emma ordered, though her pace quickened. The ascent was grueling, the snow deepening as we climbed. Tom's breathing grew labored, and I could feel his weight dragging heavier on my shoulder. But we couldn't stop, not with the thing out there. It wasn't until we reached a narrow ridge that the creature showed itself again. A dark shape moved through the storm, its glowing eyes piercing the whiteout. It was faster than before, darting between the trees with an unnatural grace. "Stay together," Emma shouted, lighting one of the torches. The flame flickered wildly in the wind, but it was enough to hold the creature back, at least for now. Greg brandished his hatchet, his knuckles white. "You think it's afraid of fire?" "I don't want to find out," Emma replied. "Keep going." The creature circled us, its glowing eyes never breaking contact. It was playing with us, driving us forward, closer to the edge of panic. When we reached the first outcrop of rock, Emma paused, scanning the landscape. "The post should be just over that ridge," she said, pointing. But the creature was done waiting. It lunged from the shadows, a blur of black against the white. Greg swung his hatchet wildly, connecting with a sickening thud. The creature recoiled, letting out a sound that wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a scream. "Run!" Emma yelled, and this time we did. The path narrowed as we climbed, the storm growing fiercer. I could feel the burn in my lungs, the weight of Tom dragging me down. But the sight of the creature, its dark form moving effortlessly through the snow, kept me going. The ridge loomed ahead, its jagged outline promising either salvation or doom. We didn't look back, not until we heard the scream. The storm closed in tighter, a relentless veil of white that turned the world into a void. Every step felt heavier, the snow pulling at our legs like quicksand. Our breath was visible, frantic clouds that dissipated too quickly. The ridge was our only focus, but the path seemed to stretch endlessly, the distance mocking our desperation. We moved as one, though the silence between us grew thicker with every passing minute. The creature was out there, circling just beyond the edges of our vision. Occasionally, we'd catch a flicker of movement, a shadow gliding effortlessly through the snow, and the dread would tighten around us like a noose. It was Lisa who faltered first. She had been quiet since we left the cabin, her face pale and her steps unsteady. When she stumbled, falling to her knees in the snow, Emma turned back. "Lisa, get up," Emma said, her voice sharp with urgency. "We can't stop here." Lisa looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I can't," she stammered. "It's watching us. I can feel it." "We all can," Alex snapped, his voice taut with fear. "But sitting here makes you a target. Move." Emma knelt beside her, gripping her arms firmly. "You're stronger than this. Just focus on me." One step at a time, Lisa nodded weakly and let Emma pull her to her feet. But the moment had cost us precious time. The creature took advantage of our hesitation. The sound came first, a guttural, animalistic noise that seemed to echo from every direction at once. We froze, our weapons clutched tightly, scanning the swirling snow for movement. There, Greg shouted, pointing to a blur of motion to our left. The creature darted through the storm, its movements impossibly fast, its glowing eyes fixed on us. It didn't charge this time. It stalked, herding us like prey. "We need to keep moving," Emma shouted, lighting another torch and waving it in an arc. But Lisa panicked. She screamed and bolted in the opposite direction, disappearing into the storm before any of us could stop her. "Lisa," Emma called, her voice cutting through the howling wind. She started after her, but Greg grabbed her arm. "You can't go after her. It's what it wants," he said. "We can't just leave her." "Emma," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "He's right. If we split up, we're finished." Her face twisted with anguish, but she nodded reluctantly. We pressed forward, though every step felt heavier now, weighted by Lisa's absence. It wasn't long before we found the trail. The snow was disturbed, heavy footprints leading away from us, but they stopped abruptly, replaced by streaks of red that marred the pristine white. Emma crouched beside the marks, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the frozen stains. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. The reality of what we were facing settled over us then. Lisa was gone, taken by the storm and the thing that lived within it. "She shouldn't have run," Alex said, his voice flat, as though he were trying to convince himself. Greg turned on him, his face livid. "Don't you dare. She ran because she was scared, just like the rest of us." "Enough!" Emma's voice cracked like a whip. She stood, her eyes blazing despite the tears that threatened to spill. "This thing wants us to fall apart. We're not giving it what it wants. Not yet," but the cracks were already forming. Alex refused to meet Greg's glare, and Sarah clutched her improvised weapon like a lifeline, her knuckles white. We kept moving, though the tension between us was palpable. The creature didn't attack again, but it didn't need to. It had already won this round, and it knew it. The ridge came into view as the storm momentarily relented, a dark silhouette against the endless white. It should have been a relief, but instead, it felt like an omen. We were closer to safety, perhaps, but farther from hope. The ridge loomed ahead, its jagged rocks jutting out of the snow like the bones of some ancient beast. We reached the point of observation just as the storm began to ease, leaving a pale, gray twilight in its wake. The small structure perched on the cliffside was barely more than a shack, its wooden walls weathered and splintered. Inside, it was mercifully intact. A single table stood in the center of the room, scattered with old maps, notebooks, and a rusted lantern. A steel cabinet in the corner sat ominously closed, and the walls were lined with faded photographs, pinned haphazardly. Emma approached the table immediately, her fingers skimming over the scattered papers. "Look at this," she said, holding up a yellowed notebook. The pages were filled with shaky handwriting, notes scrawled in the margins, and crude sketches of a figure with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. It was unmistakable. The creature we had encountered wasn't just a figment of our fear. It had a history. Greg peered over Emma's shoulder. "Predator Carmesum," he read aloud, his voice low. "Multiple sightings, always in severe storms. Stalks prey over days, instilling fear. Prolonging," he stopped, his throat tightening. "Prolonging what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "Prolonging suffering," Emma said, her voice hollow. She flipped another page, revealing a rough map of the area. Circles marked spots near the ridge, labeled with dates and the word missing. Alex moved to the cabinet, prying it open with a grunt. Inside were stacks of documents, faded and brittle, alongside a flashlight and a few cans of emergency rations. He pulled out a folder marked Incident Reports. "These go back decades," he said, flipping through the pages. Hikers, campers, even locals. They all disappeared during storms. The weight of what we were facing sank in. This wasn't an isolated attack or an accident. This thing, whatever it was, had been here long before us and would remain long after. Sarah found a journal among the scattered papers. "Listen to this," she said, her voice trembling as she read. "It watches. It waits. The snow is its shield, its playground, but it fears the light. Bright, searing light blinds it, drives it away. Keep the torches burning." The words were a lifeline, fragile but essential. "That's it," Emma said, a spark of determination returning to her eyes. "We can use this. We can fight back." "With what?" Alex snapped. "We're barely holding it together, and you think a flashlight's going to save us?" "It's more than we had 5 minutes ago," Emma shot back. "And it's our best shot." Greg found the flashlight in the cabinet and clicked it on. It flickered weakly before going dark. "Batteries are dead," he muttered, tossing it aside. "Then we use what we have," Emma said. She grabbed the lantern and shook it, the faint sound of liquid sloshing inside. "If this still works, we can fashion something brighter." We gathered around the table, pooling what resources we had. The improvised torches were our starting point, but Emma's idea was more ambitious. She wanted to create a flare, a burst of light strong enough to blind the creature, if only for a moment. As we worked, the storm picked up again, the wind howling around the small shack. The photographs on the walls fluttered, and the structure creaked ominously. "It's out there," Sarah whispered, her hands shaking as she held a makeshift torch. "I know," Emma said, "but it's not getting us. Not this time." For the first time since the nightmare began, we had something resembling a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't safe, but it was something. The storm was our enemy, but it was also our cover. If we could move quickly, stay together, and use the light to our advantage, we might have a chance. We didn't speak much as we prepared to leave. The weight of Lisa's absence, the terror of the creature's game, and the cold reality of our dwindling options were suffocating. As we stepped outside, the storm swallowed us again, the world reduced to a swirling haze of white. But now, in the shadows, we knew what waited. It wasn't just hunting us. It was toying with us, feeding on our fear, and we were determined not to give it the satisfaction. The old radio crackled to life in the corner of the observation shack, its warped dials groaning as Emma coaxed them into place. Static filled the room, punctuated by faint murmurs of a voice. She worked feverishly, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Hello," she said, leaning into the receiver. "This is an emergency. We're stranded near the ridge under attack. Please send help." We held our breaths as the static swirled, an ominous backdrop to the storm raging outside. Finally, a voice emerged, faint but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. "Received. Weather difficult hours before assistance." "Hours?" Alex repeated, his voice cracking with disbelief. "We don't have hours." Emma repeated our location, desperate to keep the connection alive, but the radio sputtered. The storm's interference made the words disjointed, but the message was clear. We were on our own for now. Outside, the wind howled with renewed ferocity, rattling the flimsy walls of the shack. We huddled close, the faint warmth of the lantern our only comfort. Sarah clutched one of the improvised torches, her knuckles white. "We need to hold out," Emma said, her voice resolute. "If we stay here, we have the high ground. We can use the light, keep it at bay. And when it decides to come through the walls?" Greg asked, gesturing at the thin planks of wood around us. "This place won't hold." "It has to," Emma replied sharply, though the doubt in her eyes betrayed her. The creature didn't wait long to test her theory. The first sound was subtle, a faint crunching in the snow just outside the shack. It was deliberate, paced. Then came the scraping. Something sharp dragged along the walls, a slow and deliberate taunt. "It's here," Sarah whispered, backing away from the door. Tom, who had been eerily quiet since the attack on Lisa, stood abruptly. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, but his stance was firm. "We can't all stay in here," he said. "It'll pick us off one by one." "What are you saying?" Emma asked. "I'm saying someone needs to keep it distracted," Tom replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "No!" Sarah's voice broke as she grabbed his arm. "We stick together. That's the only way." Tom gently pried her fingers loose. "If we don't buy time, there won't be anything left to save." Before any of us could stop him, Tom stepped outside, his torch blazing against the swirling snow. "Over here!" He bellowed into the storm, his voice a defiant roar. "You want something? Come and get it." We rushed to the window, our breath fogging the glass as we watched him vanish into the white. The light from his torch bobbed erratically, a beacon in the chaos. And then we saw it, those eyes, glowing like embers in the storm. The creature emerged from the shadows, its shape shifting and indistinct, as though the snow itself bent around it. Tom didn't falter. He hurled his torch toward the creature, the flames catching on its shadowy form. For a moment, the thing recoiled, its shriek piercing through the wind. "Run!" Tom shouted, his voice echoing through the storm. But we couldn't move. We were frozen, helpless witnesses to his sacrifice. The creature lunged, its massive shape enveloping him in an instant. His torch flickered, then extinguished, leaving only darkness and the faint trace of red staining the snow. Inside the shack, silence fell. No one spoke. No one cried. We simply stood, paralyzed by what we'd just seen. Emma was the first to break the spell. "We can't let this be for nothing," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "He bought us time," Greg said, his fists clenched. "Let's not waste it." We turned back to our makeshift flares and torches, each of us working with renewed urgency. Tom's sacrifice had given us a chance, slim as it might be. Outside, the storm raged on, and we knew it was only a matter of time before the creature returned. The cabin was deathly quiet as we worked. Even the storm, relentless and loud just moments ago, seemed to pause, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Inside, we tore apart what little we had left, splitting furniture into crude stakes, ripping fabric into makeshift wicks. The lanterns we'd salvaged were arranged in a careful arc near the base of the ridge, their dull glows barely piercing the swirling white outside. Emma crouched in the center of the room, sketching lines into the dirt with the end of a broken knife. "We'll need to lead it here," she said, pointing to the narrow path that funneled down toward the ridge. "The snowbanks are steep. It'll have nowhere to go but toward us." "Toward us?" Greg asked, his voice sharp. "Shouldn't the goal be to stay as far from it as possible? And wait for it to pick us off one by one?" Emma shot back, her gaze fierce. No, we corner it and we fight. Her words hung in the air like the last flicker of a dying flame. No one disagreed, but no one seemed ready to voice their agreement either. We don't have a choice, she added, softer now, as though trying to convince herself as much as the rest of us. Sarah was the first to speak. What do we do if the lights don't work? Emma paused, the silence drawing taut like a string. Then we keep fighting. The plan was grim but simple. Lure the creature into the choke point, blind it with the lanterns and the crude torches we'd prepared, and use the temporary confusion to drive it back. Not to kill it, we weren't naive enough to believe that was possible, but to survive long enough for the promised rescue to arrive. We moved as one, dragging the lanterns outside and positioning them carefully along the ridge. The cold bit at my fingers, each breath freezing in the air before me. Sarah worked beside me, her hands shaking as she arranged the final torch. "Do you think this will work?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. I didn't answer. As we finished, Emma stood at the center of our makeshift battlefield, her face pale but determined. "It'll come as soon as it senses us," she said. "Be ready." Greg lit the first torch, its flame sputtering before catching, and the rest of us followed. The soft glow of the lanterns turned the snow into an eerie stage, their light reflecting off the endless white expanse. We waited. First, there was nothing, just the sound of the wind and the creak of snow shifting under its weight. Then came the familiar crunch, deliberate and slow, from the far end of the ridge. "It's coming," Sarah whispered. The creature emerged from the storm like a shadow made flesh, its form indistinct but massive. Those eyes, burning with a cold fire, locked onto us with unnerving precision. It moved with a predatory grace, circling just outside the reach of the lanterns, testing the edges of our trap. "Stay together," Emma called out, her voice steady despite the fear I could see etched into her face. The creature lunged, its form blurring as it closed the distance in an instant. Greg swung his torch wildly, the flame illuminating the jagged lines of the beast's shifting body. It recoiled, a guttural sound reverberating through the air as the light struck it. "Now!" Emma shouted. We drove it back toward the ridge, the narrow path forcing it closer to the circle of lanterns. It moved erratically, its form seeming to flicker in and out of focus. Each time it advanced, the light pushed it back, the glow searing into its dark, fragmented shape. But the creature wasn't retreating, it was adapting. It began to move faster, darting between the flickering lights, each pass bringing it closer to our circle. "Keep it in the trap," Emma yelled, but her voice wavered as the realization dawned on all of us. The lanterns wouldn't hold it for long. In a final desperate move, Emma grabbed one of the larger torches and charged toward the creature, its flames bright enough to momentarily blind even us. The creature let out a deafening roar, retreating into the snowstorm, its form dissolving into the blizzard as if it had never been there. Emma stumbled back, the torch still clutched in her hand, its flame reduced to a faint ember. "It's not gone," she said, her voice hollow. "It'll be back." And as the snow began to fall heavier, erasing the creature's retreating tracks, we knew she was right. The wind howled like 1,000 voices in torment, and the snow, once so clean and pristine, now fell in thick, relentless sheets. It blurred the world, drowning us in whiteness, a cold fog that enveloped everything we had left. Our plans, our desperation, our fear. We were on the edge of something terrible, something we couldn't fully understand, but there was no turning back now. The trap we'd so carefully set seemed to take forever to activate. The lanterns flickered and trembled, the torches casting long, jagged shadows on the snow. Then a sound, low and primal, began to rise from the depths of the storm. The creature was back. It was faster this time, moving like liquid darkness, and as it neared, the very air around us seemed to tremble. The lanterns did their job at first, pushing the creature back with flashes of light, but it wasn't enough. The monster let out a terrifying shriek, and in an instant, the calm, calculated plan we had relied on shattered like glass. It lunged. I barely had time to react before the creature was upon us, its shape a blur of jagged blackness and flickering red eyes. Emma screamed, her voice lost in the roar of the wind. "Move!" she yelled, and we scattered, desperately trying to stay within the circle of light. The creature's eyes flashed, and for a moment, I thought it might vanish again, but it didn't. It surged forward, stronger, faster than before. The lanterns that had been our shield now seemed too small to contain the fury that was bearing down on us. Chris moved first. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but there was something else there too. A resolve, a determination. He ran toward Emma, who had been momentarily blinded by the creature's roar. "Get behind me," he shouted, and before any of us could react, he threw himself between her and the beast. There was no hesitation in Chris's movement. He tackled the creature with a desperate fury, pushing it back for a moment, the light from his torch flaring in the creature's face. It shrieked, and for a brief, agonizing second, it seemed to falter. But it wasn't enough. The creature twisted, and with an unnatural speed, it drove its claws into Chris's side. His scream echoed in the storm, a sound that will haunt me until the day I die. I couldn't move fast enough, none of us could. "Chris!" Emma cried, but there was no time. No time for words. No time for anything except the blood that spilled out of Chris and into the white snow, staining it a darker red. He died in moments. His body collapsed, limp and lifeless, a tragic sacrifice. The creature tore through him with an inhuman brutality, its eyes never leaving Emma. I watched in horror, frozen by the grotesque scene unfolding before me. The creature, its face a mask of darkness and malevolent hunger, turned toward Emma. She was shaking, her face pale and tight with fear, but she didn't run. She didn't have to. Emma reached for the last lantern, her fingers trembling as she lifted it high, its weak flame casting long, wavering shadows on the snow. The creature hesitated, just for a moment, and that was enough. The lantern flared brighter than before, the light harsh and sharp against the shadow that had once seemed invincible. The creature recoiled, its body writhing as though it were caught in something unseen. But it wasn't over. I could see that now. It was still coming for us. "Keep the light on it," Emma shouted, and I understood then the creature wasn't going to stop. Not until we were all gone. We had to keep it in the light, keep it away from the shadows, or it would consume us one by one. We fought back, using every last ounce of strength we had. The torches flared and sputtered, but the creature kept coming, relentless and terrible. The snow beneath our feet became slick with Chris's blood, and every step we took seemed like a slow, inevitable march toward the end. In the midst of the chaos, I could see Emma's eyes, fierce and desperate. She was holding the lantern with both hands now, her arms trembling, but she didn't stop. The creature screeched again, a sound that felt like it was scraping the very air, and we all knew, that the trap we had set, the light we had hoped would save us, might not be enough. Chris had died for nothing, and still the monster came. The wind had died down, leaving only the creaking, brittle quiet of snow settling on the ground, as if the world had been stilled in anticipation of some inevitable, unspeakable end. We were alone, Emma and I. The others, Tom, Matt, Chris, gone, their blood mingling with the snow, their bodies scattered across this forsaken mountain like broken dolls. It was only the two of us now, and I wasn't sure if we were even still alive or just waiting for whatever cruel thing the universe had in store next. I could hear Emma's breath, ragged and uneven, each inhale shaky with fear, but she said nothing. She never spoke unless it was necessary, always with that same determined, cold expression. Even when the tremors in her hands betrayed the fear I knew was crawling beneath the surface of her strength. Felt like time had lost all meaning, and with it all hope. We had lost everything, but there was still a glimmer left. The creature, whatever it was, whatever it had been, was still lurking in the snow. I could hear it, sometimes a low growl in the distance, a movement too fast to fully track, but always there. Watching, waiting, but we had a plan. "Do you have it?" Emma asked, her voice steady, though I could hear the edge of strain beneath her calm words. I nodded, clutching the last of the lanterns. It was a pathetic thing, flickering weakly in the wind, but it would do. We had something else now, something more powerful than light. I could hear the rumble of the device we'd set up earlier. A crude thing made from the few supplies we had left. The last thing we could use to stop the creature. It was improvised, desperate. But desperation can lead to terrible brilliance. The plan was simple. Lure the thing into the open, into the spot we'd rigged, and then we would hope that the explosion would do what our feeble hands could not. I swallowed, my throat dry, tight. "When I say run, we run," Emma said, her voice cold and resolute. I nodded again, though part of me wanted to break down in front of her. The only thing that kept me moving was the sheer weight of knowing I had no choice. The wind had returned, carrying with it the first bitter hints of something worse. The creature was coming closer. We could both feel it, the air shifting, the snow moving like it was alive. "Now," Emma whispered. I barely had time to react before she moved, sprinting ahead, her feet barely leaving a mark in the snow, her face a mask of determination. I followed as best I could, my breath a visible fog in the freezing air. We reached the clearing. Emma stopped, her hand outstretched. The lantern in my hand flickered, casting long shadows that danced and stretched across the snow like wraiths. And then I heard it, a low guttural growl. There was no time left. I grabbed the detonator and pressed it with shaking fingers. A moment of silence, so profound it felt like a death rattle in my chest. Before, the ground erupted. It wasn't the kind of explosion you hear in movies, full of flame and noise. No, this one was cold, sharp, almost surgical in its precision. The blast tore through the snow, shattering the air with a piercing crack that cut into the silence like a blade. I saw the creature in that moment, flung back by the force of the explosion, its form twisting in the air before crashing to the ground, a dark blotch against the white snow. It didn't move. It lay still. The snow around it was stained dark, the monster's shape still, its monstrous limbs splayed in unnatural angles. We waited. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until finally, the sound we had been waiting for, the radio crackling to life. "This is Team Alpha. We've received your distress signal. Rescue is on the way. Hang in there." I don't know how we managed to stay standing after that. I turned to Emma, but she was staring at the creature's still body, her face pale. The horror we had faced had left its mark on us. And it was only when I felt her grip on my arm, tight and unyielding, that I realized we weren't completely alone anymore. We had survived, for now, but the air was still thick with something dark, something terrible that seemed to hang in the shadows. And I could still hear it, the growl distant now, but still there, always waiting. The dawn was weak, a pale gray light creeping across the sky as the helicopter hovered above the clearing. The air was still bitter, sharp with the cold of the night that had clung to the world like an old memory. The snow, too, was unchanged, untouched by the first light of day, save for the traces we had left behind. Traces I would carry with me forever, whether I wanted them or not. The rescue team was calm, almost disturbingly so. I could see their faces through the haze of exhaustion that clouded my vision, their movements mechanical, practiced, as they rushed to pull me and Sarah into the safety of the helicopter. The noise of the rotor blades was deafening, a jarring contrast to the cold silence that had smothered us for so long. It should have felt like relief, but instead, it felt like a loud, blaring reminder of everything we had lost. Emma didn't speak. She hadn't said a word since we'd left the clearing, her face a mask of exhaustion. But even in the dim light, I could see the sharp, calculating edge in her eyes. She was thinking. I knew she was. We both were. As the helicopter rose above the cabin, higher and higher, the ground beneath us began to shrink into the distance. I wanted to feel something, anything that could be called peace, but there was nothing, just a gnawing emptiness that filled every corner of my mind. But Emma, despite the fatigue that tugged at her, despite the cuts and bruises that marred her skin, couldn't let go of one thought, one question that she kept repeating in her head, and sometimes aloud. "Where is it?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the rotors. I glanced at her, my throat dry. "Where's what?" She didn't answer. Instead, her gaze drifted out the side of the helicopter, to the expanse of snow stretching endlessly below. The world below us, still trapped in the frozen grip of winter. And then I saw it too, in the snow. At first, I thought it was nothing more than a trick of the light, a shadow of some branch or stone left by the storm. But the longer I looked, the clearer it became. The marks, red, bright against the whiteness of the snow. "Emma," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Look, there on the ground." She turned her head, her face tense, and followed my gaze. There they were, small, perfect footprints, deep and deliberate, as though something heavy had left them behind, each one connected by a faint red smear, the stark contrast of blood on snow. And they weren't just isolated in the clearing, as I had hoped. No, they led off, snaking into the wilderness beyond, toward the storm, toward something else. The ground, churned and broken from our escape, was still there too, but these marks, they weren't ours. They weren't from anything human. I felt a cold tremor creep up my spine, a chill that didn't come from the wind. "They're still here," Emma muttered, her voice barely a breath. "It's not over." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that it was done, that we were safe now, that we had escaped, but the words felt hollow, empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. The marks, those red streaks in the snow, hadn't disappeared, and as I watched, I realized that they led away from us, as though the creature, or whatever it had been, was moving deeper into the storm, moving away. But then I saw something else, something far worse. The footprints didn't stop. They continued on, but they weren't alone anymore. There were others, more of them, smaller, lighter. Not the heavy, deliberate marks we had seen before, but something else faster, almost skittering. Emma saw it too. She stiffened beside me, her breath catching in her throat. "We're not the only ones," she said. "They're not alone." A chill ran through me, deep and unsettling. As I turned back to the rapidly retreating landscape, the helicopter's roar drowned out the world, but the images in my mind, the prints in the snow, remained. The creature wasn't alone, and neither were we.